In a quiet town rocked by corruption, a young boy who hasn't spoken since his father's death finds strength in silence, loyalty in a retired police dog, and courage through the legacy left behind. As secrets unravel and a once trusted judge stands exposed, the boy and his dog become the unlikely symbols of a nationwide movement for justice. Guided by those who refused to give up and confronted by those who tried to bury the truth, he learns that a voice doesn't always need to be loud to be heard. But just as the town begins to heal, one question lingers. What happens when justice is only the beginning? Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The whisper of rain on the window pane barely masks the silence in the Patterson house. It wasn't the gentle silence of peace. It was the kind that carried weight, like a held breath that never quite let go. In Medford, Oregon, where pine trees lined the gray streets and clouds hung low like watchful sentinels, the house on Bramble Court had become a quiet prison for two souls trying to survive grief in their own ways. One of them was 10-year-old Eli Patterson, a boy who hadn't spoken since the day they brought his father's badge home in a folded flag. Max, the German shepherd who once stood side by side with Officer Daniel Patterson, now lay with his chin resting near Eli's feet, ever vigilant. He was no ordinary dog, not in training, not in loyalty, and certainly not in the way he never left Eli's side. Since that terrible night, Max had become more than a canine partner retired from duty. He was the only one who still understood Eli's. Silence wasn't absence. It was armor. Eli's mother, Claire, moved through the house like someone rehearsing the steps of a life she no longer believed in. Bills gathered on the counter, unopened. The refrigerator hummed too loudly in the stillness. Sometimes she'd glance at her son and look away just as quickly, as though his silence cut deeper than words ever could. She used to hum while doing dishes, but now the only sound was the soft scrape of porcelain, the click of her wedding band against the edge of a glass. That morning, everything shifted. Claire found it buried in a pile of outdated notices and faded envelopes, an official-looking letter, heavy with consequence. As she peeled it open, the bold header made her breath catch. State of Oregon Family Court. Her eyes skipped through. The lines, heart racing, custody review hearing, her name, Eli's. An anonymous report had triggered a review, citing concerns over her mental health and Eli's well-being. Her fingers trembled. No, she whispered to no one, but Eli heard. Her. He always did. He sat cross-legged on the floor, sketching something in his notebook, always the same drawing again and again. A badge, a dog, a man in uniform, and next to the man always a small boy with no mouth. She knelt beside him, the letter limp in her hands. Eli, sweetheart, we have to go to court. He didn't look up. His pencil darkened the shadows around the boy's eyes in the drawing. Max's ears perked. A low, concerned whine escaped his throat. Claire had faced death once, when two uniformed officers knocked on her door and told her Daniel wouldn't be coming home. But this was different. This was a slow kind of dying, a threat wrapped in paper and sealed with cold bureaucracy. Later that day, she called the courthouse, her voice shaking. I need to speak with someone. I can't lose my son. I'm doing my best. I am. But her pleas were met with scripted replies and polite detachment. The hearing was scheduled. A judge would decide. That was that. When Claire hung up, Max moved closer to Eli, placing his head in the boy's lap. Eli didn't flinch, didn't blink. His small hand rested on Max's head, fingers curling into fur. The only signal he gave was the way his eyes fixed on something distant, something only he could see. That night, Claire stood at the kitchen sink, staring into the dark backyard. Rain tapped on the glass, soft and insistent. She hadn't noticed how worn her hands looked until she saw their reflection in the window, veined, tired, aged by grief. From the living room came the sound of nails clicking on hardwood as Max rose suddenly. He padded toward the front door, ears forward, alert. Claire turned. He paused, then added, "Thank you." She blinked, taken off guard by the softness of it. She nodded. "You're welcome, baby." As she turned to leave, Eli picked up a pencil and a fresh page. Just one more sketch before bed. He drew a boy on a porch, beside an older dog, a badge in his hand, and the wind carrying leaves around their feet. No names, no dates, just a title above it in small, neat letters. "Justice will always hear you." And in that stillness, with the house quiet, and the stars blinking overhead, the boy who once spoke only through silence finally slept in peace. The applause that followed wasn't thunderous, but deep, grounded. That evening, back at the Patterson house, Claire tucked a new photo into a frame. It showed her, Eli, Max, and the volunteers standing on the courthouse steps. Eli held one of his drawings high in the air, a simple image of a community building a bridge over a chasm, with one word printed in block letters across the top: together. Max barked softly at the knock on the door. It was Camille, the former CPS worker, now helping build a trauma-informed care network across the county. She handed Claire a packet. "This is the pilot for the Parenting Rights Re-Evaluation Program. We want your input." Claire smiled. "I'll take a look tonight." Camille hesitated before leaving. "There's something else," she said. "People have been asking how to explain this to their kids, what to say when they ask why so many families were hurt." Claire looked past her at Eli, who was in the backyard brushing Max's coat with long, even strokes. "Tell them," she said, "that the system forgot it was supposed to serve the people, but the people remembered." That night, the kitchen table was full again. Lena updated the federal case file summaries. Raymond highlighted reports for new investigative referrals. Claire drafted a grant proposal for the town's new legal literacy project. Eli sat nearby, flipping through a thick notebook. When he stopped on a blank page, he lifted his pencil slowly. No rush, no pressure. Just a moment. Then he began to draw. This time, he sketched a row of hands, different sizes, shapes, and colors, interlocked above a courtroom door. No faces, no names, just unity. And below it, for the first time, he wrote a word in block letters with his own hand: us. The air was crisp that morning, the kind that carried memories on its wind. The courthouse lawn had been cleared and set for something different. Rows of white folding chairs facing a makeshift stage. Garlands of local flowers hung across a banner that read, "In honor of those who stood when it was hardest." At the center, a simple wooden podium and a single empty chair beside it. Claire stood near the edge of the crowd, adjusting the lapels of her navy dress. Her eyes moved over the gathering townspeople, people she once feared would never understand, now placing flowers, shaking hands, offering quiet smiles. She spotted Judge Eleanor Price greeting a group of volunteers near the back and nodded to her. The new leadership didn't just work behind closed doors anymore. It walked among the people. Max sat at Claire's feet, eyes always on Eli, who stood just behind the stage. He was taller now, his face leaner, eyes more focused. In his hands, he held a worn photograph, Daniel in uniform, crouched beside Max. One hand on the dog's chest, the other resting on Eli's tiny shoulder. The boy had carried the photo everywhere for weeks, folded and unfolded so many times, the corners had begun to fray. The ceremony began with the town choir. Then a few remarks from community leaders. A plaque was unveiled in front of the courthouse. Steps bearing the names of those whose testimony had sparked the federal inquiry. Daniel's name led the list. Below it was engraved a quote taken from one of his final recordings. "The truth isn't loud. It just waits for someone to carry it forward." Claire was next to speak. She stepped up to the podium, her voice steady despite the thud of her heart. "I used to think silence was a cage, that losing my voice and my sons meant we'd be lost. But I learned silence can also be a fire. one that burns away what no longer belongs, and out of it something new can grow. She looked out over the crowd, at the families who had come from across the county, holding framed photos of their own, siblings, parents, children. We didn't ask for this fight, but we didn't back down either. And today, we honor those who were brave enough to speak, and those whose silence still changed everything. Applause followed, warm and sincere. Then came the moment everyone had waited for. Claire turned and extended her hand to Eli. The boy walked to the podium alone, the photograph still in his hand. Max rose and followed, standing just behind him. The wind picked up slightly, brushing through his hair, flapping the edge of the photo. He looked out across the sea of faces. Some were smiling, others were crying, all were waiting. He took a breath, then another, and then, for the first time since Daniel's death, he spoke. "My dad told me justice is for everyone," he said, "even me." The words were soft, but they reached every ear. A gasp, then a hush, then a wave of applause that began with one person and rippled outward until the entire crowd was on its feet. Max barked once, Eli smiled, Claire wept. Afterward, the town hosted a small festival in the square. There were booths from local artists, food trucks, and a wall of handwritten letters from community members who had lived through the system and survived it. Eli's drawings were featured on canvas prints, donated by a local gallery. One of them had been enlarged and hung near the entrance to the courthouse. His most recent sketch, a courtroom wrapped in ivy and branches, with beams of sunlight shining through the roof. Claire stood in front of it with Raymond and Lena, arms folded, quiet. "He'll be okay," Raymond said softly. "He already is," Claire replied. As the sun set, Eli sat with Max near the same bench where it had all started, his sketchpad open once again. He didn't draw this time, he just looked around at the people laughing, sharing meals, holding hands, and closed his eyes for a moment, not to shut the world out, but to hold it. In years past the way they always do, quietly, relentlessly, with little ceremony. The courthouse lawn remained green and well-kept, and the plaque bearing Daniel Patterson's name remained untouched, polished every spring by someone anonymous. No one asked who, they just knew someone still cared enough to remember. Claire's hair had begun to silver around the temples. She wore it short now, practical. Her days were filled with committee meetings, outreach calls, and weekly check-ins with families starting their first court case under the new community oversight initiative. The work never slowed, but she didn't want it to. Every life she touched reminded her that the silence they had once been forced to endure had become a tool, not a weapon, but a bridge. Eli, now a teenager, sat on the back porch that overlooked the same quiet yard where he once held Max's leash for hours waiting. The leash still hung from a nail by the back door. Max, older now, moved slower, his steps measured and careful, but his eyes never dulled. Wherever Eli went, Max followed. Always. In front of Eli sat a hardcover book, Signal, printed in dark ink across a textured blue cover. His name was on the spine. Below it, in smaller print, illustrations by the author. The book wasn't long. It didn't need to be. Just a collection of moments, drawings, short written reflections, each one capturing a fragment of the journey that had once threatened to swallow him whole. He read the final page aloud. "If silence is a language, then truth is what it says. And sometimes the only way to be heard is to stop trying and start standing." He closed the book and rested his hand on Max's back. Claire stepped outside with 2 mugs of tea. She handed one to Eli and sat beside him. They watched the wind move across the yard. "He would have been proud of you," she said. Eli nodded. "I know." She smiled softly. "And the book? You decided to publish it under your name?" "I thought about using Dad's," Eli admitted. "But it's not just his story anymore." Claire looked out at the horizon, where the trees moved in soft unison. "No, it's yours too." From inside the house came the sound of the doorbell. Another delivery, likely more letters or messages. From readers, the book had reached more people than anyone expected. One copy had even been requested for the Library of Congress. Another was being used in a judicial ethics class at a university in Oregon. Claire had read reviews calling it a quiet revolution in ink, but none of that mattered to Eli. He didn't write it to be reviewed. He wrote it to remember. That night, Eli returned to his room and set the book on his shelf between a copy of his father's badge and a faded photograph of them all. Daniel, Max, Claire, and a much younger version of himself. He kept the old sketchpad too, stored safely in a drawer he rarely opened. Max curled at the foot of the bed. His breathing was slower these days, more deliberate. Eli reached down, resting his hand on the old dog's shoulder. Max opened one. I gave a single huff of air and returned to sleep. Claire came to the door, leaned on the frame. Want to say anything before lights out? She asked. Eli looked at her. Yeah. It was the slow, painful beginning of something rare, truth taking root. Outside the building, a group of volunteers was organizing a donation drive for legal aid. Kids handed out flyers with Eli's drawing of the scales of justice, newly printed. On heavy cardstock, it had become a symbol in town, not of anger but of vigilance. A few days later, Claire received an unexpected call. Officer Will Romero, one of the men who had served with Daniel, asked to meet. They sat at the park where Eli often walked with Max. I lied, Romero admitted. About the night Daniel died. Claire's breath caught. He didn't run into that alley without backup. He called it in. He waited, but the command never came. Dispatch was told to stall. I was on the other end of the line, and I heard him ask for confirmation 3 times before he moved in. Claire's voice was a whisper. And no one came. Romero shook his head. Because Leclerc told us not to, said it was internal, said it would blow over. I stayed quiet because I wanted my pension, but that boy, he made me remember why I put on the uniform in the first place. He slid a flash drive across the table. It's the recording of that night. I saved it, couldn't delete it. Claire didn't speak. She reached out and took the drive with shaking fingers. Eli watched from the swings, Max lying beside him. In the fading light, that evening they sat together and played the file. It was short, crackling, grainy, but Daniel's voice rang clear. This is Officer Daniel Patterson, badge number 7112, entering alley on Redford and Pine. Suspect spotted. Requesting backup. Repeat, requesting backup. No response. Proceeding. Claire pressed pause. Eli looked at her. Slowly he opened his sketchpad and began to draw again. Not the alley, not the radio, but his father's badge. Held not in his own hand this time, but in the hands of another officer, an ally, a promise that the truth would be carried forward. A breeze rolled gently over the Medford courthouse lawn, lifting the edges of folding tables, rustling banners, and carrying the scent of fresh-brewed coffee from a nearby cart. The crowd wasn't massive, but it was focused, thoughtful. Old veterans in worn jackets, young parents holding toddlers, and teens from the local high school all milled about the new civic event. Justice begins at home. At the center of it stood Claire, clipboard in hand, speaking softly with a young mother who held a thick folder of court documents. She listened first, always listened, then nodded, pointed her to the table where legal volunteers were helping attendees begin the process of reviewing old family court cases. These weren't protesters or pundits, they were survivors, citizens, people finally learning how to stand up again. Eli sat at a bench beneath a newly planted tree, Max resting quietly at his feet. On the table beside him sat a small stack of his drawings, printed neatly on cream cardstock, a hand-lettered sign in front that read, "Take one if you believe things can change." Nearly every card was gone. Lena approached, carrying 2 cups of cocoa. She handed one to Claire and sat beside her at the info booth. "This is bigger than anything I've worked on," she said. "And it's working. I just got word. We passed the threshold." The Federal Oversight Committee's moving. To the second phase? Claire smiled faintly. That means review panels? Lena nodded. Community seats, public participation, real oversight, and Medford gets the pilot program. Raymond joined them, a binder under his arm. I've already signed up for training. Retired or not, I'm not letting this place go. Back to what it was. Claire looked out over the tables, the families in line, the volunteers offering forms, water, quiet reassurance. It won't, she said. Not with people like this. Later that day, a new judge addressed the crowd, appointed by a unanimous community vote after Leclerc's formal removal. Judge Eleanor Price stood behind a simple podium, no robe, just a dark blazer and a silver pin, shaped like balanced scales. We were all complicit, whether by action or silence, she said. But today, we begin again, not by rewriting the past, but by learning from it. She invited community members to join her in reshaping the justice system, public hearings, town-wide mediation forums, school outreach programs. She promised transparency and welcomed criticism. Her words were firm but humble. The audience didn't applaud. They rose, every single one of them. When it was over, a reporter caught up with Claire outside. "Do you know what they're calling it?" she asked. "The boy who spoke without words. That's the headline everywhere." Claire managed a tired smile. He doesn't need headlines. Back home, the town had changed again. Not loudly, not publicly, but with little signs. A flyer for a judicial accountability group on the community board, a new nameplate on the courthouse door, belonging to an interim judge selected by public vote. The old stories didn't echo quite as loudly. Eli went back to drawing, not obsessively, not in grief, but in reflection. He sketched people now, the faces of those who had helped, the hands that had reached out. Sometimes he gave them wings. Sometimes he gave them trees growing from their shoulders, symbols of growth, of roots, of rising. Max returned to his routines, guarding the front porch, sniffing every delivery, nudging Eli's hands for attention at just the right moments. His ears had gone a little grayer. His pace had slowed, but his eyes still watched everything. Claire returned to the therapy program, now fully funded by state grants. More families arrived each week, and when they asked how she kept going, she pointed toward her son. He never gave up, she'd say, so neither did we. One evening, a package arrived from Washington. Inside was a bound report, findings from the Medford Review. Dozens of pages, witness statements, legal recommendations. And at the front, a dedication to the families who lost their voices and to the ones who found them again, especially those who never spoke but were heard the loudest. Claire placed the report on the shelf beside Daniel's folded flag. It belonged there now. That night, she stood on the porch while Eli sat beside Max on the steps, the sky awash in violet and gold. She looked at them both and said, "They'll never forget your name." Eli didn't answer, but he turned his face toward the last light of day and smiled. The town hall filled slowly that evening, not with reporters or activists, but with neighbors, parents, teachers, retired police officers. People who had once avoided eye contact with Claire in the grocery store now stood in line beside her, holding printed notes and hesitant expressions. The sign above the stage read, "Community Justice Reform Forum." Below it, a microphone stood, bare, waiting for voices that had once been silenced. Claire sat in the front row with Eli beside her, Max curled calmly at his feet. The boy tapped a pencil against his knee, his sketchpad resting but unopened. This wasn't a day for drawings. It was a day for something else. Raymond opened the forum with a short introduction. He wasn't a man for speeches, but his voice carried weight when it mattered. "This isn't about blame," he said. "It's about recognition and responsibility." Then came the first surprise. Officer Ben Aldridge stepped up to the mic. Claire stiffened. She remembered his face from the early days, standing at her front door with papers in his hand and detachment in his eyes. He was the one who had escorted Max to the pound, the one who had told Eli to step back. That memory had lived in her gut like a stone, but now he stood with his cap in his hands, cleared his throat and said, "I failed." He paused. "I did what I was told. I didn't ask questions. And when I saw that boy look up at me, I still turned away." The room was silent. "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just want the record to show that what I did, was wrong. And I'm going to spend the rest of my career making sure it doesn't happen again." Claire watched him walk back to his seat. Eli looked up at her, his expression unreadable. But he reached for her hand and held it. The next speaker was a social worker named Camille Jensen. She'd reviewed Daniel's file years ago. Claire remembered her name in the paperwork. She had once declared the officer's suspicions unsubstantiated. Now she stood shaking, tears in her eyes. "I should have listened," she said. "He came to me with everything, files, names. He told me he was scared for his family. I wrote it off as paranoia. I can't fix that, but I'm going to testify when the time comes." One by one, people who had stood on the wrong side began to cross back over. Even Claire couldn't fully understand the shift, but she knew what she was witnessing wasn't weakness. There were still names on the investigation board, judges, officers, clerks, and beyond them, politicians who had grown fat off fear and silence. "This town isn't the only one," he told Lena, "but it can be the first." Lena agreed. They both decided to stay until the first trial was set. And when federal indictments came down 3 weeks later, Claire watched the news from the living room couch, her arm around Eli's shoulder, his badge still displayed on the mantel. "You think he'd be proud?" she asked. Eli didn't answer. He just reached over and held her hand. The town held a community ceremony not long after. Not for celebration, there was too much still to face for that, but for acknowledgement, for healing. They planted a row of dogwood trees near the town square. One of them bore a plaque, "In memory of Officer Daniel Patterson, who refused to be silent." Claire stood beside it, hand on Eli's shoulder, Max seated between them like always. The mayor read a few words. A pastor said a prayer. But it was Claire who turned the silence into something stronger. "My husband didn't die in a headline. He didn't die in a scandal. He died trying to protect this place and protect the truth, and our son carried that truth farther than most adults ever would." She looked down at Eli. "Your voice doesn't have to be loud to matter." Afterward, people came to speak with them, some with tears, some with thanks. A few just nodded, passing by with reverent quiet. One woman clutched Claire's hand and whispered, "Because of you, I filed my case again." That night, the house was full. Friends, supporters. Raymond brought pie. Lena made coffee. Brian arrived late with copies of new legal templates for vulnerable families. Eli sat in the center of it all, Max's head resting in his lap, sketchpad open but untouched. He didn't need to draw that day, he just watched, listened, laughed once when Max sneezed and knocked over Lena's cup. Claire saw it, saw the corners of her son's mouth curl upward without hesitation. Hope wasn't loud. It didn't march. It planted itself quietly and waited for spring, and now it was blooming. The letter arrived with no fanfare. Just a simple white envelope slipped through the mail slot one Tuesday morning, bearing the insignia of the Department of Justice. Claire opened it at the kitchen table, alone, while Eli still slept with Max curled at his feet. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the pages. Her eyes scanned the words slowly, as if daring them to be real. A national inquiry was underway. The DOJ had reviewed the files Raymond submitted, paired them with sworn testimonies gathered in the weeks since the hearing, and launched a sweeping investigation into patterns of misconduct in rural judicial systems. Medford was only the beginning. The letter closed with an invitation, an official appearance in Washington, D.C., to speak on the impact of community-led accountability and the role of families like hers. Claire set the letter down gently. She didn't cry, but her chest swelled with something that had nothing to do with vindication. That night, she told Eli. He didn't react at first, simply traced a circle on the table with his finger. Max shifted at his feet. "Do you want to go?" Claire asked softly. Eli looked up, and after a long pause, he nodded once. The trip east was quiet. No reporters, no crowds. The department had arranged private travel. Raymond and Lena came along, sitting a few rows behind them on the plane. Max lay calmly beneath Eli's seat, his eyes darting every time the cabin creaked or an engine shifted. Tone. Claire kept a hand on her son's shoulder the entire flight, as if to tether them both to something solid. Washington was everything Medford wasn't. Steel and stone, busy streets, suits everywhere. But inside the department's briefing hall, the atmosphere was oddly reverent. Eli stood beside Claire while officials thanked them for their courage, their restraint, their clarity. One woman, a deputy director with silver hair and steady eyes, knelt to Max's level and smiled. "We read about him," she said, "and about you." Eli didn't respond, but he held the badge tightly in his hand. Later, in a smaller ceremony at the Capitol, Eli was presented with a National Civilian Bravery Medal. The room was full of people who understood silence, veterans, investigators, parents. Eli stood in front of them without speaking, medal around his neck, Max at his side. A boy and his guardian, steady and silent. One afternoon, while Raymond and Lena discussed federal charges in the kitchen, Claire found Eli outside in the backyard. He was planting something in the dirt near the fence line, a small seedling in a clay pot. She approached slowly, kneeling beside him. "What are you planting?" Eli didn't answer. He simply pointed to the tag sticking from the soil. "Dogwood." Claire smiled faintly. "Your dad loved those trees." Eli looked at her. Then slowly he pressed something into her hand. It was a page from his sketch pad. A courtroom again, but not like before. This one had light streaming in from above, and people, so many people, standing together, some with heads bowed, others with hands on each other's backs. And at the center, a boy, no longer alone, no leash in his hand, no shadows on the walls. Redemption. Claire folded the drawing gently. "We're going to be okay." That night they received a call from the State Attorney General's office. A formal investigation was being launched into systemic abuse in Medford's judicial circuit. LeClaire's name was the first on the list, but not the last. Claire sat by the kitchen window, phone still in her hand, as Max snored lightly at Eli's feet. She didn't feel triumphant. She felt steady. The next day, Claire and Eli walked into town together. People stared, some nodded, a few waved. One man crossed the street to speak. "I used to think your husband made a mistake, that he should have stayed quiet. I was wrong." Claire said nothing. She didn't need to. Eli looked up at the man, then handed him a folded drawing from his pocket. The man opened it, saw himself in the sketch, standing with others, facing a broken wall. On the other side, a light shone. He didn't speak either, just nodded and walked away. That evening, Max lay on the porch, head resting on his paws. Eli sat beside him with his sketch pad, staring out at the trees beyond the fence. Claire brought out 2 mugs of cocoa, setting one down beside her son. "Tomorrow," she said, "we're going to start helping other families. The ones who didn't get lucky like we did." Eli looked up at her, eyes steady, and then for the first time in months he opened his mouth. He didn't speak. He smiled, and it was enough. Spring settled into Medford like a slow sigh, brushing the rooftops with light and curling into the quiet corners that had been long forgotten. The courthouse, once feared and untouchable, stood with new glass doors, brighter windows, and a freshly painted exterior. But the real change wasn't in the paint. It was in the people walking through those doors. Different faces, slower steps, eyes that held questions instead of fear. Inside one of those offices, Claire sat across from a social worker, the same woman who had once considered separating her from Eli. Now, she took notes with careful reverence. "You've been cleared for permanent custody," the woman said softly. "No further reviews." Claire didn't speak. She simply nodded once, then looked toward the window where Eli sat on a bench just outside, Max curled at his feet. The boy leaned back with his face to the sun, a sketchpad in his lap, pencil tapping idly. He didn't draw as much anymore, not because he had nothing to say, but because the urgency had lifted. He could speak in his own time now, and everyone had learned to listen. That same week, the town council passed a resolution to establish a therapeutic program for families affected by judicial abuse. Raymond had suggested it. Lena drafted the proposal. Claire agreed to be its face, though she insisted it be run by professionals, not just survivors. "We're not here to relive it," she said. "We're here to rebuild." The first meeting was held in the old library, a quiet place with tall windows and worn wooden floors. The room filled quickly. Mothers, grandparents, young adults carrying folders thick with paperwork no one had believed before. Claire stood at the front with a microphone in her hand, and Max sitting beside Eli, both of them like anchors in a room full of drifting hearts. "I'm not here to tell you what happened to us," she began. "Most of you already know. I'm here to tell you what happens next." She looked at Eli, who met her gaze without flinching. "We start again," she said. Applause came gently, respectfully. Raymond remained in town longer than he'd planned. He wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. Two officers approached from the rear entrance. One of them read aloud from a folded slip of paper. "Sir, you're being placed on administrative detainment pending formal inquiry. Please come with us." Leclerc's hand shot toward the bailiff's bench. He grabbed the gavel. "Don't touch me!" The room erupted. Bailiffs moved quickly. The judge swung wildly, the gavel crashing against the edge of the table. Someone screamed. A camera fell. It took 3 men to restrain him, arms locked around his flailing body. Claire pulled Eli back, shielding him. Max barked once, loud, sharp, commanding. Leclerc froze, dragged away. He shouted over his shoulder, "You think this is justice? This is mob rule." But no one followed him. No one answered. When the doors closed behind him, the silence returned. Raymond exhaled slowly. "It's done." "No," Lena said. "It's just starting." Reporters swarmed, calling for comment. Claire ignored them. She crouched beside Eli, her voice shaking. "Are you okay?" He nodded once, then he handed her the drawing. It wasn't the judge. Not this time. It was a courtroom full of people, some angry, some crying, some kneeling. In the center, a boy with a badge stood beside a dog, and above them, sunlight broke through a shattered ceiling. Hope. That night, the news cycle didn't rest. The footage of Leclerc's breakdown aired in every corner of the country. Local stations dubbed it the silence that spoke. Commentators debated the implications. But in Medford, at the Patterson house, the screens stayed dark. Eli sat on the porch with Max pressed against his leg, the badge clutched in one hand, a pencil in the other. And for the first time in a very long time, the house behind him felt safe. The town didn't change overnight. The sidewalk still cracked under bicycle tires. The grocery store still ran out of milk before noon on Sundays. But something in the air had shifted. People walked slower near the courthouse now, eyes lingering on its clean white steps like they could still hear the echo of Judge Leclerc's gavel hitting the floor. In every barbershop, church basement and diner booth, the same name kept rising in conversation. Patterson. Claire hadn't gone out much since the hearing. Reporters still hovered near the edge of the lawn. Letters filled the mailbox, some scrawled with gratitude, others with suspicion. She sorted them each night, one pile for hope, the other for warning. The hope pile was growing. Inside, Raymond sat by the dining table, listening again to Daniel's recordings, cataloging every voice, every timestamp. Lena had joined him, her laptop screen glowing late into the night. They were building a case, not just against Leclerc, but the entire apparatus that had shielded him. Claire stayed close, her presence quieter now, more focused. She had the look of someone who'd crossed through fire and was still walking. One morning, a knock came at the door, not from press or strangers, but from someone familiar. A CPS officer, the same woman who had stood on their porch the day Max was taken. Claire tensed instinctively, blocking the door with her body. "I'm not here for enforcement," the woman said softly. "I came to apologize." Claire didn't. "And sir, I didn't know the extent of what was happening. None of us did. We followed orders, checked boxes. I never asked who filled them in." Claire looked down, her voice sharp. "You still took my son's dog. You let them scare him." "I did," the woman whispered, "and I'll never forget the look in his eyes when we left. That's why I'm here now. I'm resigning, and before I go, I'm making a formal statement. I want it on record. I want the truth on my conscience, not silence." Claire studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "Then write it down." Word spread quickly. One by one, others began stepping forward. A former family court clerk admitted to shredding documents under orders. An officer who had once been assigned to Daniel's department requested a public hearing to clarify errors in official reports. The dam had cracked and water was rushing through. Claire watched the change unfold with cautious hope. Every name added to the record felt like a breath long held, finally exhaled. Eli noticed it too. He'd been drawing less but watching more. He started sitting by the front window again, notebook in his lap, sketching only when something pulled him. Max stayed close, never far from his side. They moved as one. In the middle of the room, Eli paused. Everyone watched him. He lifted his hand and made the same subtle gesture again. A signal. Max sat, then lowered his head gently, allowing Eli to remove something from the lining of the collar. A final object. A folded sheet of paper. Eli walked forward and placed it on the clerk's desk. Raymond opened it and read aloud. A letter, handwritten, Officer Daniel Patterson. It details names, dates, locations of documented abuses of power, and it ends with one line: "If my son must speak for me, let it be with the truth I left behind." Claire wiped tears from her cheek, but her expression was fierce. The courtroom remained silent. Even the CPS representative sat still, her file untouched. Max returned to Eli's side. The boy turned, walked back across the room, and sat down. No words, no sound. But everything necessary had been said. Leclerc didn't speak again. The hearing was suspended. A recess declared pending further review. Bailiffs escorted Leclerc from the bench, not under arrest, but no longer untouchable. Reporters waited just outside the doors. The moment the judge emerged, flashes popped and voices called out. He didn't answer. Inside the hallway, Claire turned to Raymond. "Is it enough?" "It's more than we ever thought we'd get. But will it stick?" He nodded. "It will, and even if it doesn't, people saw, people heard." Eli looked up at them, then pulled out his sketch pad. He drew without pause. Max, standing in front of a cracked bench, a boy raising a hand, not to signal the dog, but to silence a tyrant. Claire leaned down beside him, voice low. "You did it, baby. You broke the silence." Max licked the boy's cheek once, and Eli smiled. Just faintly, but it was there. Leclerc sat alone in his chambers. The heavy door closed behind him like a cell. The voices outside were louder now. Reporters calling his name, lawyers murmuring about emergency filings, the low thrum of footsteps circling like a hunt. He stared at the monitor on his desk. The paused live stream feed showed his own face. Frozen in mid-shout, gavel raised, rage written across every inch of him. A man unmasked. The knock came quickly. 2 bailiffs entered. One of them carried a manila folder. The younger one, nervous, handed it to the judge. "This just arrived from court administration. A formal request to recuse yourself from any further hearings involving the Patterson case. There's also mention of a pending review by the State Oversight Board." Leclerc's jaw twitched. "I haven't been charged." "No, sir," the bailiff said quietly, "but they're watching now. Everyone is." The door closed behind them, and for a long time the judge didn't move. Then slowly he rose from his chair, crossed the room, and opened the drawer of a tall cabinet. Inside was a bottle of bourbon and a loaded revolver, remnants of another life. He considered both. He chose neither. Instead, he grabbed his coat. In the courthouse lobby, Raymond, Lena, and Claire waited with Eli, who sat beside Max, sketchpad balanced on his knees. His newest drawing showed a scale. One side held a gavel, the other a child's badge. The gavel cracked down the middle. The doors burst open. Leclerc marched into the room, red-faced and boiling. "This is not over," he barked. "You think you've exposed something? You've started a war you don't understand." Bailiff stepped forward instinctively, but he pushed past them, toward the center of the lobby. Claire stepped between him and her son. "Back away!" Leclerc glared at her. "You think anyone will care once the headlines fade? I built this system. I made it run." Raymond moved closer. "You poisoned it." Leclerc pointed at Eli. "That boy is a puppet. You're all using him." But Eli stood, quietly, firmly. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out Daniel's badge. He held it up high, arm unwavering. The lobby went silent, and then footsteps. More press had arrived, drawn by the chaos. Flashbulbs popped. A reporter shoved a microphone forward. "Judge Leclerc, did you authorize the removal of evidence from Officer Patterson's case file?" No comment. "Do you deny the voice on the audio recordings is yours? Those files are fabricated. Is it true you conspired to discredit a dead officer and his family?" "I said no comment." Leclerc shoved the microphone aside, sending it clattering to the ground. A gasp rippled through the room, then turned slightly toward Max. Without hesitation, he moved his hand in a small, practiced gesture, a signal. Max responded instantly. He trotted forward toward the judge's bench, not aggressively, not barking, just a silent, deliberate movement. From his collar, something small dropped, a microchip sealed in a clear sleeve. It slid across the floor until it bumped against the base of the bench. The courtroom froze. Leclerc looked down, then up, his face flushed. "What is this?" Raymond stepped forward. "Evidence submitted on behalf of the child. Encrypted files detailing systemic corruption, audio logs, financial trails, threats, all tied to decisions made in this very courtroom." The judge stood, voice rising. "This is a stunt, an outrageous disruption. Bailiff, the courtroom." The camera was still rolling. Claire remained seated, calm. "Your Honor, we ask that the contents of the file be reviewed immediately in the presence of all parties, and that it be entered into the record as an official submission." Leclerc's lips tightened. "Denied." But it was too late. Denise's voice echoed from a tablet on the back table. "File is live." The speakers crackled, then Daniel Patterson's voice filled the courtroom. "And if this gets to Claire or Eli, know that I didn't stop. I saw what they were doing. Leclerc signed off on the removals. He knew about the seizures. The senator funded the cover-ups. They'll come for me, but I won't back down. Someone needs to speak for the families they've destroyed." Gasps rose from the few people in the gallery. The court clerk stopped typing. Even the CPS attorney looked shaken. Leclerc stepped back from the bench. "This is a violation of court procedure. I will hold you all in contempt." But the bailiff didn't move. Raymond stepped forward. "You're not in control anymore." Eli sat still, unmoving, watching the judge, and though the boy said nothing, his silence rang louder than any gavel. The audio stopped, leaving a silence so thick it swallowed the room. Leclerc's hand hovered in the air, frozen halfway between a gesture and a threat. His face had gone pale beneath the courtroom lights, a shadow of the smug authority he'd carried through every prior hearing. Claire didn't move. Eli didn't flinch. Max stood beside him like a statue, watching the judge with the calm awareness of a soldier awaiting orders. The courtroom camera, still streaming, captured everything. Raymond stepped forward slowly, setting a printed transcript of the recording on the table. This evidence was acquired legally, provided by a whistleblower, and authenticated. It confirms the deceased officer Daniel Patterson was investigating judicial misconduct at the time of his death. Leclerc's voice came back with a growl. "This is inadmissible. That file was obtained through illegal—" "It was given to the boy by his father," Claire interrupted. passed down in the event that the system failed us. The judges. Eyes flicked toward her, then to Eli, who simply stared. It was not the gaze of a child seeking sympathy. It was quiet defiance, something rooted, something unmovable. Leclerc turned to the court reporter. "Strike that from the record." But the reporter didn't type. The bailiff spoke up from the wall. "Sir, the live stream has over 10,000 viewers. The footage is public now." Leclerc's mouth opened and closed once, like he was struggling for air. "Shut it off." "No, sir. That order has to come from court administration." Denise stepped forward with a folder in hand. "We also have the certified files of 10 prior families removed from their homes under questionable rulings, all signed off by your office, and campaign finance data showing irregular donations tied to the very non-profits Daniel's report identified. We'll be entering those as exhibits." Claire placed her hand on Eli's shoulder, steady and proud. The boy glanced up at her briefly, then back at the judge. Leclerc slammed his gavel on the desk. "This is my courtroom. I will not be ambushed by baseless conspiracy theories and dramatics." But he sounded weaker now, hollow. Raymond crossed his arms. "You tried to erase a man's legacy, and you underestimated his son." Leclerc's hands gripped the edge of the bench, his knuckles white. "The boy can't speak. You've manipulated him." Eli stood. It was slow, deliberate. He stepped forward, never releasing Max's leash. The dog followed, quiet and controlled. She set up shop in the dining room, spreading maps and case files across the table. Claire learned quickly that she'd once worked with Raymond on several internal task forces and had since gone private, helping families targeted by corrupt systems. She studied Eli's drawings like they were coded maps. "Your son sees everything," she said, not unkindly. "He knows how they think." Raymond handed her the second flash drive, the one Max had carried. "Still locked," he said. "Not for long," Lena replied, pulling a small decryption rig from her bag. "We'll see what Leclerc and his friends tried to erase." It took hours, but when the file opened, no one breathed. A distorted audio. Recording played, a meeting, muffled voices, Leclerc's unmistakable tone. Another man, unidentified, a plan. "We leak the report, let him take the fall." Officer Patterson was digging too deep. "Frame him posthumously, seal it, bury the badge." Claire dropped into a chair. "They were trying to destroy his name." Raymond leaned forward. "They didn't just kill him, they tried to erase him." Eli stood quietly in the corner, listening. Claire turned to him slowly. "Your dad wasn't crazy. He wasn't wrong." And Eli, for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, nodded. A single, steady motion. Claire closed her eyes. Her hands clenched into fists. They tried to bury the truth, but they forgot who he left behind. The sun was barely up when Raymond replayed the audio again and again. Each time the voices sounded colder, more calculated. One of them was definitely Leclerc, but it was the other voice that chilled the room. A man speaking calmly about destroying evidence, manufacturing a narrative. Claire stood behind him, arms crossed tightly over her chest, as if bracing against the words. Lena paced near the window. "They planned every inch of it. From the moment Daniel got close, this wasn't panic, it was strategy." Raymond nodded. "Daniel figured out what they were doing with seized assets. The court and the police department were funneling property, vehicles, homes, cash, through state programs, then kicking donations back to political campaigns. A closed loop of corruption," Claire's voice cracked. "And when he pushed back, they killed him," Raymond said flatly, "and then tried to destroy his reputation." Brian dropped a folder on the table. "There's more. Leclerc used his position to fast-track judgments against vulnerable families, veterans, single mothers, non-English speakers. They couldn't fight back, and when they tried, he used CPS as a weapon." Claire flinched. "That's what they're doing now. Exactly, Lena said. They've done this before. You're just the first person who fought back hard enough to be noticed. Claire looked at Eli, who was seated at the far end of the room with Max's collar in his hands. He turned the tags over, running his fingers across the worn edges. He hadn't drawn that morning. Instead, he was simply watching, listening. Raymond reached into his bag and pulled out a manila envelope. I was holding this back until we were sure. He handed it to Claire. It's Daniel's final case file, not the one on record, the real one. He gave me a copy 3 days before he died. Claire opened it slowly. Inside were photographs, a ledger, receipts from city auctions that didn't match the inventory logs, and a short handwritten letter. Her hand shook as she read it aloud. Claire, if anything happens to me, know that I didn't walk into it blind. I couldn't let this poison and keep spreading. I had to do something. Tell Eli I did it for him, for both of you, for every family they've hurt. I love you, always. Tears welled in Claire's eyes. She sat down hard, unable to speak. Eli walked over, climbed into her lap, and pressed his forehead against her chest. She wrapped her arms around him tightly, the letter still clutched in her hand. Raymond looked at Lena. We leak it, all of it. Lena hesitated. It could backfire. If we move too fast, they'll spin it, say it's fake, manufactured. Then we go piece by piece, Raymond said. Just enough to force Leclerc into the light. When he's desperate, he'll make mistakes. Claire wiped her eyes. And Max, when do we get him back? Tomorrow, Denise said from the doorway. The judge approved the emotional support designation. He'll be returned before the hearing. Claire's heart surged. Eli, did you hear that? The boy looked up, and for the first time in days, his expression softened. He reached for his notebook and quickly sketched something. A boy with a badge, a dog beside him, and behind them, the outline of a judge's chair cracking down the middle. Raymond watched him draw. He's ready. That night the house stayed lit. No one slept. Brian monitored surveillance feeds. Lena coordinated with a local news outlet, preparing to release the first official story. Raymond listened to old voicemails Daniel had left him, hoping for one last clue. Claire sat by Eli's bedside, the letter tucked into a drawer beside his pillow. She didn't cry anymore. She had run out of tears. What remained was something harder, sharper. The next morning, they stood by the front window as the city van pulled into the driveway. The driver opened the side door, and Max bounded out before the leash was even clipped. He ran straight to the porch, tail low, eyes wild with recognition. Claire opened the door, and Eli stepped outside. Max stopped for a split second, then leapt forward, pressing his body against the boy. Eli fell to his knees, arms wrapped tightly around the dog's neck. No sound came from him, but Max whimpered, licked his face, nudged his chest. Raymond stepped outside, holding a small device. He knelt and carefully removed the collar, then extracted the chip from the lining. Still intact, he said. We load this at the hearing. Denise appeared behind them with her tablet. News just hit. Leclerc's office released a statement denying any knowledge of misconduct, but the community's already reacting. Comments are blowing up. People are angry. Good, Claire said. Let them be. Inside, Eli sat with Max on the living room rug, the boy's hand resting on the dog's back. Claire watched them from the hallway, Daniel's letter still in her pocket. This wasn't about survival anymore. It was about justice, and for the first time in a long time, it didn't feel out of reach. The courthouse felt different this time. It wasn't quieter. There was still the low murmur of clerks and the occasional echo of footsteps, but something under the surface had shifted. A tension, a presence. Claire walked beside Eli, her spine straight, her hand steady on his shoulder. Max walked just ahead of them, alert, his leash loose, but his gait purposeful. He was no longer a removed part of the story. He was a symbol, walking back into the lion's den without fear. The courtroom itself had been cleared of most reporters, but the change in the air was undeniable. A camera had been installed near the rear, approved by the court for transparency. After the story broke, The live feed wouldn't air on national news, but local channels had secured the right to broadcast the hearing. Leclerc had reluctantly agreed, no doubt believing he could maintain control. Raymond stood by the courtroom doors, eyes scanning the hallway. Lena leaned against the wall, arms crossed, watching the bailiffs with quiet calculation. Brian waited, in a nearby cafe, with a copy of the chip's contents uploaded to a secure server. If anything happened, the files would go public instantly. "Everything's in place," Raymond said softly as Claire approached. "All we need is the spark." Claire nodded and looked down at Eli, who wore his dark green hoodie and carried his sketchpad tucked under one arm. Max stayed at his side, head low but calm. Inside the courtroom, the bailiff called their names. They walked in together. Leclerc was already seated, his eyes flicked up, narrowed slightly at the sight of Max, but he didn't speak. His robe looked more like armor today, buttoned high, sleeves pressed. Claire didn't miss the slight tremor in his hand as he picked up the court file. It wasn't much, but it was a crack. The CPS attorney made her opening statement, leaning heavily on bureaucratic language, emotional well-being, behavioral consistency, professional evaluation. She didn't mention the articles, didn't dare. But the undercurrent of fear was there. When Claire was asked to speak, she stood slowly and cleared her throat. "My son hasn't spoken since the night my husband died. But that hasn't made him invisible. He understands more than you think. He's watched everything, remembered everything. And Max is the only connection he has left to the man who protected this city." Leclerc didn't look at her. He simply nodded for the hearing to proceed. Claire sat beside Eli. The boy glanced up at her. They submitted the request to the court. A hearing on Max's status would be held within 48 hours. If approved, Max could return on the day of Eli's final custody hearing, legally protected. Denise got a call that night from her contact at the paper. "The judge tried to block our second article," the reporter said. "But we published anyway. The clicks are pouring in. People want answers." Claire read the article twice. This one named names, mentioned patterns, asked questions in bold print. One quote stood out above all the rest. "The silence of a grieving child is not a weakness, it's a testimony." She walked into Eli's room, where he was lying on his bed, hands behind his head, staring at the ceiling. She kissed his forehead. "We're getting him back." Eli turned his head slightly, enough to look at her with quiet certainty. And then, for the first time in weeks, he moved to the edge of the bed, opened the nightstand, and took out something small and silver. His father's badge. He held it out to her. Claire swallowed hard and took it in her hand, feeling the weight settle into her palm. Heavy, but not unbearable. Outside, the wind was shifting, and inside the walls of the courthouse so was something else. The morning the call came, Raymond knew it before he even answered. His instincts, sharpened by decades in the bureau, told him the air had shifted. It wasn't just pressure anymore. It was threat. He picked up the phone, expecting a delay in paperwork, another procedural stall from the courthouse. Instead, the voice on the other end whispered only one sentence before disconnecting. "They're planning an accident." Raymond stood there. For a full minute, the line dead, the house silent except for the clatter of Claire in the kitchen. When he finally moved, it was with precision, quiet, fast, focused. He didn't tell her right away. Not yet. Not until he was sure. By midday, Denise confirmed the worst. Their contact at the local paper had disappeared. She missed a scheduled interview, hadn't returned calls, and hadn't been seen at her apartment. Her editor said she'd been digging deeper than expected, chasing leads tied not just to Leclerc, but to campaign donations from a state senator whose name appeared in one of Daniel's recordings. "She vanished," Denise said over speakerphone, her voice flat. "Left behind her notes, laptop gone, no signs of struggle, just gone." Claire went still, holding a dish in her hands. Eli looked up from the couch. He hadn't drawn since the night before. His silence was no longer a wall. It was a message. In itself, Raymond leaned forward, hands steepled. They're making moves, cutting people off one by one. This isn't about custody anymore. It's about containment. Brian had already run a background on the senator. Connections to Leclerc. Funding streams linking the family court budget to out-of-state donors. Claire tried to keep up, but the names and numbers blurred into one thing. Danger aimed at her. Son. That night they reinforced the doors, put up security cameras, changed the locks again. Max was still locked away in the city facility, but Raymond had a contact who'd agreed to do nightly checks, making sure the dog stayed safe until the ruling on his emotional support status. The countdown had begun. Eli sat on the stairs as the grown-ups moved through the house like shadows. Claire sat beside him, brushing the hair from his forehead. "I'm sorry it's gotten this bad," she whispered. "I never wanted this for you." He didn't flinch. Instead, he slid his sketchpad into her lap. The new drawing was rough, rushed. 2 cars on a narrow road, one veering off, a child's handprint on the window. Beneath it, in small, careful letters, a word he hadn't written in months. Trap. Claire's stomach dropped. "What is this? Baby?" Raymond took the pad, his eyes narrowing. "He's warning us." Claire stared at her son. "Is someone trying to hurt you?" Eli didn't speak, but he looked out the window, then at the phone on the kitchen counter, and finally at the old badge in Claire's hand. Raymond stepped outside, calling in a favor. An hour later, a car pulled into the driveway. A woman stepped out, tall, leather jacket, sharp eyes. She walked up the steps like someone who'd been in the thick of something worse. Claire opened the door slowly. "Lena Cruz," the woman said. "Raymond called me, said you've got a war coming." Lena didn't waste time, but they made a mistake. They gave us something to point to. Denise nodded. "Threatening a minor, breaking into a protected residence. We go to the journalist." Claire overheard the conversation and stepped into the room. "Do it. Let the world see what they're trying to bury." The article went live that night. The headline read, "Family of slain officer targeted after exposing corruption in local courts." The picture below it was grainy but powerful. Eli, clutching Max's leash, eyes hollow but burning with something deeper. The community began to stir. An old neighbor dropped off a casserole and a note. "We're behind you. Don't stop." Someone else left a stuffed animal for Eli on the porch. Anonymous. Kind. But the phone calls started too. First blocked numbers, then a voicemail, distorted. Male whispering, "You should have stayed quiet like your husband." Claire didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She played the message for Raymond, then deleted it. "They think silence means weakness," she said. "But they've never met my son." That night, she sat beside Eli in the dark, both of them listening to the quiet. Eli pressed the badge to his heart once more. And somewhere, locked away in a cold cage across town, Max lifted his head and growled. Sunlight filtered through the blinds, soft and deceptive, as if pretending the night before hadn't happened. Claire sat at the dining table, her hand wrapped around a coffee mug she hadn't taken a sip from. The words were still there on the wall, faint red shadows beneath a layer of primer paint. Raymond had offered to cover it himself before Eli saw it again, but Claire had stopped him. "Leave it," she said. "Let it remind us." Eli hadn't spoken of it, not the break-in, not the message, but he'd begun drawing again, this time with sharper lines, darker strokes. There was a new focus in him now, like a compass had turned inside his chest and started pointing somewhere specific. Raymond stood beside the table with Denise, a laptop open between them. "We're running out of time," he said. "The hearing's been pushed up. CPS wants a closed-door session, no press, no public." Claire shook her head. "We can't let that happen." "We won't," Denise said. "We're filing for an open hearing, public interest clause. But that's not all." She turned the laptop around. A document sat open on the screen. Request to recognize Max as a certified emotional support animal. Claire's breath caught. "That's our angle?" Denise nodded. "It's a gamble, but it forces the court to consider the psychological bond between Eli and Max. We include documentation, photos, statements from Eli's pediatrician, references from Daniel's former precinct. If we win, Max will be required to be present, Raymond added, and once Max is in that room, so is the chip Eli hid in his collar. The second drive, we can present that in real time, not filtered through the court's tech team. Claire leaned back slowly. Her fingers trembled as she reached for the edge of Eli's drawing. That chip has more than the judge expects, doesn't it? It has voices, Raymond said quietly. Not just Daniel's, others, people Leclerc worked with. One of the files mentions sealing evidence to avoid scandal. The language is coded, but there's no doubt what it implies. Denise leaned in. We let the boy and the dog speak in their own way. It's the only way the judge won't see it coming. Eli appeared beside them, holding a drawing in both hands. He placed it gently on the table. It showed a courtroom, only this time it wasn't a judge behind the bench. It was Max, standing tall, alert, facing a crowd. Beneath him, a boy held up a signal with one hand. The same signal Eli had once used when training with his dad. Claire touched the paper with reverence. I'll get the pediatrician's letter today, she said. Raymond nodded. I'll work the legal side. Denise and Brian will monitor chatter. We still don't know how deep Leclerc's reach is. As the team dispersed to begin their tasks, Claire stood in the front yard, watching the wind blow across the lawn. The leash hung on the porch rail, its metal clip swinging gently. Every time she saw it, her chest tightened. Max wasn't just a dog. He was a promise. At the pound, Max sat rigid in his kennel, ignoring the food, ears tilted toward the far end of the building. His eyes never left the door. He wasn't waiting to be walked or fed. He was waiting for Eli. The next day, we've got a chance. But there's something else. CPS is pushing hard. They've expedited the review. Claire stiffened. What does that mean? It means the next hearing may decide custody. Permanently. That night, Claire sat at the edge of Eli's bed. He stared up at the ceiling. Max curled protectively at his side. She brushed his hair back gently. They want to take you from me, she whispered, voice cracking. But I won't let them. Not without a fight. Not ever. Eli didn't speak, but he took her hand and pressed it lightly to Max's collar. Claire felt something there. She pulled it loose. A narrow, flat chip secured under the tag. A second drive. She stared at it. You've been hiding this? Eli met her eyes, unwavering. A few feet away, Raymond stepped into the doorway, his expression unreadable. He's not just hiding things. He's protecting you. Claire nodded slowly, fingers tightening around the chip. Then it's time. We protect him back. The notice came by courier. No warning, no knock, just a dull thud on the porch as the envelope dropped and the engine roared away. Claire picked it up with a knot already tightening in her stomach. Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the letter and read the bolded line at the top. Emergency motion to remove animal from custodial setting. She stared at the words, mouth dry. Beneath the legal jargon, one truth screamed through. Max. They were coming for Max. She drove straight to Raymond's, the envelope clutched in her hand. Eli and Max sat silently in the back seat, the boy's hand never leaving the dog's fur. Raymond read the letter twice, jaw clenched. Leclerc's changing tactics. He can't discredit you, so now he's targeting the emotional core. Claire's voice cracked. They're trying to separate Eli from the only living link to his father. Denise arrived 10 minutes later, her face pale with fury. This was filed under emergency status. They've claimed the dog poses an unpredictable psychological risk in a home with a non-verbal minor. It's a lie, but it's enough to justify temporary seizure while the case is reviewed. Eli didn't move. He just sat in the corner of Raymond's study, holding Max tight against him. The look in his eyes was something Claire hadn't seen before. Not grief, not confusion. It was fear, pure and raw. Raymond turned to Brian. They're accelerating everything. Pressure from the inside. They know something's coming, Brian nodded. They're trying to cut off the emotional strength before we go public. Denise paced the room. We need a strategy. If they take the dog, We lose momentum, and Eli, he'll shut down even more. But it was already too late. The knock came just after dusk. A uniformed officer and a young woman in CPS navy blue stood at the door. The officer was polite but firm. "We have a court order to impound the animal pending behavioral evaluation. Please comply peacefully." Claire's heart thudded. "This is wrong." "I know," the woman said quietly, eyes flicking to Eli, who stood behind his mother, silent, pale, unmoving. "But I have no choice." Raymond stepped forward. "At least let the boy say goodbye." The officer hesitated, then nodded. Eli knelt beside Max. The dog whined softly, ears pinned, sensing something terribly wrong. Eli reached into his pocket and pressed a small object into the dog's collar. Quick, hidden. No one else noticed. Max licked the boy's cheek once, then stood. Eli didn't cry. He didn't scream. He just watched, arms hanging limply at his sides as they led Max out the door and into the back of the waiting animal control van. The red taillights bled through, the dark as it disappeared down the street. That night, Claire couldn't get him to eat, couldn't get him to sleep. He sat on the floor by the front door, the leash still in his hands, as if Max would come trotting back through it at any moment. Raymond made calls. Denise began contacting the press. Brian pulled up surveillance, footage from the impound facility. "We'll get him back," they all said. But the truth hovered over them like a storm cloud. They were losing time. The next morning, another blow hit. CPS filed a motion to accelerate the final hearing, claiming Eli's emotional instability required immediate reassessment of Claire's parental rights. The court date was moved up. They had 72 hours. "We need a distraction," Denise muttered. "Something that puts Leclerc on defense," Raymond nodded grimly. "We have to drop a piece of the puzzle, just enough to make him sweat." They drafted a short press release and sent it to the local newspaper. The headline appeared the next day, bold and unforgiving: "Retired officer's widow questions local." Judge's ethics, hidden files surface. It spread faster than they expected. Talk radio picked it up, online forums lit up. A reporter called Claire directly, asking about the drive. She said nothing. But the look in her eyes when she hung up told Raymond everything. Eli was watching all of it unfold from the couch, sketchpad in hand. This time, he drew something different. A cage, a leash, and a boy reaching for a shadowed figure, Max, behind. Bars. Claire taped the drawing to the wall next to the others. She looked at Raymond, her voice hoarse. "We've got to turn this tide. We've got to bring him home." Raymond didn't respond right away. He just turned to the laptop, opened a file, and played a short audio clip. Daniel's voice filled the room, steady and low. "If something ever happens to me, follow the silence. That's where the truth hides." The night came heavy and strange. The air in Medford was thick with the kind of quiet that didn't feel right, not peaceful, not still, but expectant. Claire couldn't sleep. Neither could Eli. He lay curled on the couch, wrapped in the flannel blanket his father used to wear around the fire pit. Max's leash still rested beside him, as if keeping vigil. Claire checked the locks again, twice, then once more. Raymond was upstairs, reviewing audio files, splicing together fragments of conversations recorded through Daniel's hidden mic. Denise and Brian had left earlier, needing rest before the next round of calls and court filings. The house felt both too full and too hollow. Claire's nerves twisted in her chest. Everything had moved so fast. The seizure of Max, the court's pressure, the leak to the press, and now something invisible pressed in from all sides. She walked softly into the kitchen and poured herself a glass of water. That's when she noticed it, the back door, unlocked. She could have sworn she locked it. She always locked it. Her breath caught in her throat. She stepped forward, slow. The door wasn't open, just resting on the latch. Maybe she missed it. Maybe. Then the floor creaked upstairs. Her heart slammed. She set the glass down without taking a sip, reached under the sink, and pulled the small kitchen knife they kept taped there, just in case. Her voice barely broke a whisper. "Raymond." No answer. The house remained still, but something had shifted, a current beneath the silence. Claire stepped into the hallway, bare feet soft against the wood, knife held low. She passed Eli asleep on the couch and pressed her fingers to his shoulder gently. His eyes fluttered open, and in a second he was fully awake, as if he had never really fallen asleep. She placed a finger to her lips. "Don't speak. Don't move." Another creak upstairs, then nothing. She led Eli behind the coat closet, pressing him into the corner, crouching in front of him like a shield. The knife felt pitiful in her grip, but she would use it if she had to. Then she heard it, a whisper, not a voice, a sound, scrawling. From the living room, Claire turned her head slowly and saw it, a message written across the wall in red, jagged strokes. The ink was still wet, bleeding into the wallpaper, words that crawled into her throat and squeezed, "Stop digging." She stood fast, grabbed Eli's hand, and bolted to the stairs. Raymond met them halfway, face pale, gun drawn. "Someone was here," he said. "I heard them, but they're gone." Claire pointed. "The wall, I saw it," Raymond said, jaw tight. "They left it while we were downstairs. They searched the house, inch by inch. No broken windows, no signs of forced entry, just the door left unlatched, a ghost that came and went, leaving only the message." That night, Eli didn't draw. He sat at the table with his father's badge in his hands, turning it over and over again until his knuckles went white. Claire crouched beside him. "We'll be okay," she whispered. "I swear to you." Eli didn't look up, but for the first time he pressed the badge to her chest and left it there. The next morning, Raymond met with Denise and Brian. The break-in had rattled them all, but more than that, it confirmed what they feared. They were being watched. "They wanted to shake us," Raymond said. "But you need to be careful now. The more noise we make, the more dangerous this gets." Claire looked over at Eli. He was sitting again, drawing. This time the picture was different. A man behind a desk, gavel in hand, face dark and twisted. And beside him a boy and his dog, watching, waiting. That night, Raymond stayed in the guest room. Max slept in the hallway, positioned perfectly between Eli's room and the front door. Just before dawn, Claire woke to the sound of the laptop fan humming in the kitchen. She stepped in quietly. Raymond sat with headphones on, one hand steady on the keyboard, the other pressing a speaker wire to his ear. She whispered, "Did you find something?" He looked up slowly. His face was pale. "I found the start of something," he said. "And if it's what I think it is, we're not just dealing with a corrupt judge." She frowned. "Then what?" Raymond leaned forward. "We're dealing with a system that buried the truth for years, and now, thanks to Eli, the cracks are showing." Claire stood in the kitchen's silence, heart thudding. Outside, the wind stirred again, but this time something else had arrived with it. Not fear, momentum. The coffee shop on 4th Street had never seen a morning like this one. It wasn't the clink of mugs or the hum of casual conversation that filled the air. It was tension, pulsing beneath the surface like a drumbeat. Claire sat at the corner table with Raymond, her hands wrapped around a paper cup she hadn't touched. Across from them, 2 more people joined the booth. A man in a grey hoodie and a woman with short black hair and eyes that missed nothing. Raymond introduced them simply. Brian, Denise, trusted. Claire nodded. Max lay under the table, curled at Eli's feet. The boy sat between them, silently sketching in his notebook. No one asked him questions. They all seemed to understand. He was already telling them everything they needed to know, in lines and shading, in the silence that never wavered. Raymond pulled out a stack of documents. The judge's name comes up too often. Patterson wasn't the only one trying to build a case. These files suggest others tried before him, internal investigators, whistleblowers, even a district clerk who vanished. All trails lead to Leclerc. Denise took the papers, flipping through them with surgical precision. "This is enough to raise hell, but not enough to burn him down. We need testimony, patterns, people willing to talk." Claire exhaled slowly. People are scared. He has reach. That's exactly why we go public, Raymond said. Not with everything, just enough to make them look twice. Enough to force a second hearing. Denise nodded. Pressure builds slowly, then all at once. Raymond turned to Claire. You're not just a mother anymore. You're the face of this fight. The second that judge realizes you're coming for him, he'll strike back. Hard. Claire's jaw clenched. Let him. The strategy took shape over the next few days. They began compiling a profile, witnesses, past decisions, sealed records that suddenly looked more like cover-ups than judgments. Denise contacted a local reporter she trusted, someone who'd once been punished for probing into court finances. Meanwhile, Brian worked on tracing the flow of money between the courthouse and several shell non-profits. The deeper they went, the worse it became. Claire felt herself changing. The fear that had once wrapped around her like chains had started to loosen. She stopped apologizing when she called offices. She stopped flinching at the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. It wasn't courage, not exactly. It was exhaustion turning into resolve. In town, murmurs began to spread. An anonymous leak to the press questioned the ethics of several family court rulings. A retired officer went on record about odd silences in Daniel's investigation. Another man, someone Claire had never met, left a note on her porch. He took my kids, too. I'll talk. At the center of it all was Eli. He didn't speak, but his drawings multiplied, a courtroom falling into shadow, a dog snarling at a masked man, a mother holding her son while figures in suits watched from the dark. Claire kept each, taping them to the living room wall like pieces of a puzzle. Then came the call from her lawyer, one she'd begged pro bono help from weeks before. "I've filed for a new hearing," the woman said, "with the public attention building and the inconsistencies in the case record." She gripped the phone tighter. "What do you mean?" "The flash drive, it was flagged. I monitor encrypted file signatures for certain patterns, military-trained systems. What your son just handed over, that wasn't a stunt. That was a message. And someone, somewhere, wanted it buried." Claire's voice trembled. "You're saying Daniel left that for us? I'm saying someone killed him to make sure it stayed hidden. But your boy, he just put a target back on your family." She looked across the room at Eli. He stared out the window again. Max pressed against his legs. Raymond's voice was firm now. "Don't trust the court, and keep that dog close." The line went dead. Claire set the phone down slowly. In the stillness of the room, Max lifted his head. He was already watching the door, as if he'd been expecting this call all along. The morning light fell in muted streaks across the living room floor, slipping between the blinds like cautious fingers. Claire sat on the edge of the couch, phone pressed to her ear, her free hand trembling slightly. On the other end of the call, Raymond Hollis sounded like he hadn't slept in days. Maybe he hadn't. The man didn't waste words. "I need a copy of everything on that drive," he said. "Today. Don't bring it anywhere. I'll come to you." Claire nodded, even though he couldn't see her. "It's with the court now. They kept it after the hearing." "That's bad," Raymond said flatly. "Very bad. If that drive contains what I think it does, it's not just evidence, it's ammunition, and they won't let it surface quietly." She lowered her voice, glancing toward Eli. He was on the floor with Max again, drawing quietly. "What exactly is on it?" "A set of encrypted audio logs," Raymond answered. "Daniel's voice, dates, names, something he was working on off-duty. I don't know how deep it goes yet, but it's enough to rattle people who wear robes and badges, including Leclerc." Claire's breath caught. "Wait, are you saying the judge—" "I'm saying your husband died for trying to do the right thing," Raymond interrupted. "And now your son just took the first step toward finishing what Daniel started." Later that afternoon, Claire stood at the kitchen window, watching the driveway. The sound of gravel shifting made her chest tighten. A rusted black Suburban pulled in. Raymond stepped out slowly, tall and broad-shouldered, with a worn marine jacket zipped to the collar. His hair had thinned, but there was something about his posture, unshaken, composed. Max stood the moment he saw the man, ears forward, tail still. Recognition. When Raymond knocked, Claire opened the door cautiously. He gave her a tired nod. "Mrs. Patterson." "Claire, please." His eyes softened for a moment. "You look just like the photo Daniel kept in his locker." He stepped inside and immediately crouched near Max, offering his hand. The dog sniffed once, then licked his fingers. Claire noticed the ghost of a smile on Raymond's face. "Still remembers me." Eli came into the room silently, holding one of his sketches. Raymond didn't speak to him at first. Instead, he crouched lower, meeting Eli's eyes, not demanding. "Anything, just waiting. Your dad and I saved each other more times than I can count," Raymond said, voice low. "He trusted me with things no one else knew, and now it looks like he trusted you." Eli handed over the drawing, Max delivering the flash drive. Raymond studied it closely. "That's how you did it?" he asked gently. Eli gave a tiny nod. Raymond looked at Claire. "He's smart, smarter than most grown men I've met in this business." He set the drawing on the table and pulled a thick laptop from his bag. "I've started decoding the files. Daniel split them across several layers. It'll take time. But what I've heard so far," he hesitated, "it's bad. There's a pattern of judicial misconduct, asset seizures, police reports buried, and at least 2 closed cases where suspects just disappeared." Claire sat down, the blood draining from her face. Leclerc's name came up. Raymond met her gaze. "Clear as day. On one of the recordings, Daniel's briefing a contact, mentions Leclerc by name, says the judge had been using his seat to silence internal investigations." Claire felt her breath leave in a sharp exhale. "My God." Raymond closed the laptop. "I'm bringing in 2 people I trust, former bureau, no badges anymore, but they know how to move quiet. We're going to document everything. Child Protective Services is authorized to conduct a home evaluation, and if I see that dog here again, he will be removed." A bailiff stepped forward. Claire reached for Eli's hand, but the boy didn't move. His fingers stayed wrapped around Max's leash, his expression unchanged. But his eyes, they burned. Outside the courtroom, Claire dropped to her knees. "Eli, I'm sorry. I didn't know it would be like this. I didn't know they'd—" Her voice broke. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. Inside his backpack, zipped into a hidden pocket, lay something no one else knew about. Something his father had given him the night before he died. Something he hadn't dared show anyone. Not yet. Max nuzzled his arm, as if to say, soon. The system thought it understood silence. But they were wrong. Eli wasn't afraid. He was waiting. The wind outside howled against the windows of the Patterson home, rattling the glass like a warning. Inside, the silence had returned, dense, unresolved. Claire paced the living room, arms folded tightly across her chest. Every hour since the hearing replayed itself in her mind like a cruel loop. Leclerc's cold voice, the way Max stood without fear, Eli's stillness. She'd tried to get through to someone, anyone, left messages with family law attorneys, pleaded with CPS for more time. But none of it mattered. The court date was set, and everything felt stacked against them. Max sat by the window, eyes trained on the door like a soldier on watch. He hadn't moved in hours, except when Eli stirred. Eli sat at the table with his backpack open beside him. He hadn't drawn since the hearing. Instead, he stared at a single object in his hand, a slim, matte black flash drive, small, silent, like him. He remembered his father's voice that night. "If anything happens, and you ever feel like no one's listening, use this. But be smart, son. Use Max." It hadn't made sense then, but it did now. 3 days passed, and when the courtroom doors opened again, the atmosphere was colder, more clinical. Claire held Eli's hand tighter this time, her eyes darting toward Leclerc, who adjusted his robe and gestured them forward. The courtroom was emptier than before. No gallery, no distractions, just them, CPS, and the judge. Leclerc didn't even look up as he spoke. We will proceed with evidentiary review. Miss Patterson, has your son made any verbal progress since our last hearing? Claire shook her head, carefully. He communicates in other ways. That's not sufficient, Leclerc replied, already scribbling something on a notepad. Max sat obediently beside Eli, ears perked. Eli didn't blink. He simply reached into his backpack, fingers moving with practiced care, and pressed his hand lightly to Max's neck. The dog's ears twitched. He rose, walked over to the boy's open backpack, and retrieved the flash drive hidden in the lining. The courtroom froze. Leclerc frowned. What is the animal doing? Bailiff, restrain. But Max wasn't aggressive. He carried the drive in his mouth, walked calmly toward the center of the room, and placed it at the foot of the judge's bench. Then he sat, eyes forward, unflinching. Claire gasped. Eli, what is that? The boy said nothing, but he didn't have to. A clerk approached the drive cautiously, picked it up, and handed it to the bailiff. Leclerc looked visibly annoyed. Is this some kind of stunt, Miss Patterson? Claire shook her head. I've never seen that before. Leclerc examined the drive. We'll take a recess. This will be reviewed by the court's technical team. If this is a disruption, I will consider it in my final ruling. As they were escorted from the room, Claire crouched next to Eli. Where did you get that, sweetheart? What was on that? Eli looked at her, his eyes wide. He didn't answer, but she saw something behind that silence. Intent. That evening, Claire sat at the kitchen table, replaying the moment again and again. Max lay beside Eli, who had returned to his drawings, but now his lines were different, sharper, darker. He was sketching the courtroom. The judge, a dog in motion, a boy watching. It wasn't art, it was memory, precision. Her phone rang just after 10, unknown number. She hesitated, then answered. Claire Patterson? The voice was low, cautious. Male. Yes. Who is this? My name's Raymond Hollis. I served with your husband a long time ago. I used to work with the Bureau. I've just seen something very interesting. Heart thudding. Max? The dog didn't growl, but his stance said everything. Someone was coming. A knock. Not frantic, not loud, just enough to be chilling at that hour. She opened the door a crack. A man stood beneath a black umbrella, his trench coat speckled with rain. He held out a folded paper. Ms. Patterson, official notice. Please confirm receipt. Claire took it, numb. As he turned to leave, she called after him. Who reported us? He didn't turn around. You'll find out in court, ma'am. She closed the door, bolting it behind her. Eli watched from the hallway, his eyes wide but unreadable. Max stood in front of him like a shield. Claire knelt beside her son. We'll fight this, she said, more to herself than to him. Eli looked up for the first time that day. He didn't speak. He never did. But Claire felt the promise in his stare. The silence wasn't surrender. It was a storm waiting to break, and far away, in an office lined with certificates and leather chairs, Judge Thomas Leclerc circled a date on his calendar. A thin smile played on his lips. The game had begun. The courthouse loomed like a monolith under a sky smudged with gray. Claire tightened her grip on Eli's hand as they approached its cold steps. The boy didn't resist, didn't speak, just walked beside her in silence, his free hand clenched around the worn collar of Max's leash. The dog, despite the posted warnings about animals, walked calmly beside the boy, head held high, like he knew this place wasn't meant to scare them. It was meant to be challenged. Inside, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and linoleum floors echoed each nervous step. Claire's stomach churned. Everything felt too clean, too polished, too indifferent. A woman in a navy blazer led them to a bench outside courtroom 4B. You'll be called shortly. Please don't let the dog in the courtroom unless the judge allows it. Claire nodded, saying nothing. Eli sat, Max pressing close. No words, no sounds. Just the quiet, coiled tension of a child who hadn't spoken in months, but heard everything. Then the doors opened. Case number 1-745, Patterson versus State. Judge Thomas Leclerc didn't look up as they entered. His voice was clipped, precise. The courtroom was small, almost claustrophobic. An American flag stood in the corner like a forgotten relic. The clerk gestured toward a long table. Across from them, a representative from Child Protective Services sorted through a file with unbothered confidence. Leclerc finally glanced at Claire. His gaze lingered, appraising. "Ms. Patterson, you understand the reason for today's hearing?" Claire stood slowly. "Yes, Your Honor. And you've been informed of the report filed?" She nodded. "I was told someone submitted concerns, but we're fine. My son is safe. He's grieving. That's not a crime." Leclerc raised an eyebrow. "Selective mutism, trauma indicators, financial instability, and now a child who hasn't spoken since his father's death." Claire's voice faltered. "He's just healing in his own way." Max let out a quiet whine. Eli sat motionless, fingers knotted in the leash. The judge's eyes flicked to the dog. "And the canine unit, why is the animal present?" Claire opened her mouth, then hesitated. Max is part of our family. He was Daniel's partner. He hasn't left Eli's side since." Leclerc held up a hand. "This is a courtroom, not a kennel. Remove the dog." That's when it happened. Max stood, not aggressively, not with growls or bared teeth, just tall, steady, unblinking. He didn't move toward the judge, he didn't move at all, but his presence filled the room with a silent defiance. The CPS worker turned. "Your Honor, perhaps—" "I said remove the dog," Leclerc snapped. Claire's voice cracked. "Please, he's not dangerous." But Eli's stare was already fixed, wide, alert, sharp, and though he said nothing, his hand twitched once at his side. Just a small movement, but Max saw it. The dog sat down again. The courtroom went still. Leclerc adjusted his glasses. "Let the record show that Ms. Patterson has brought an unpermitted animal into the courtroom and has shown signs of non-compliance." Claire's breath caught. "But we didn't mean he was just—" "You will maintain order in my courtroom or risk the consequences," Leclerc said coldly. "If the child is unable to speak for himself, I will interpret that silence accordingly. The hearing will reconvene in 3 days. In the meantime,